Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. The HiT cast offers a weekly look at Hollywood from a conservative point of view. Sick of media bias infecting Hollywood headlines? Tired of stars insulting your views? HiT has your back. Now, here's your host, Christian Toto.
Welcome to episode 80 of the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment. This week we're speaking with Adam Bellow, a veteran literary agent and the CEO of Liberty Island, a home for right-of-center authors. This week's show is sponsored by ABC. Come work for us. We'll overlook your nastiest tweets, assuming you're part of the resistance. Before we begin, I want to thank HitCast listeners. Our last episode was our biggest yet as far as downloads and listens. Thank you. And also a more specific thank you to one of our listeners, Branson. He reached out to me via email. I just want to kind of say, hey, thanks for writing back to me. I really appreciate it. And looking forward to your feedback as well as other people. You could write to me at christian@hollywoodintoto.com. Love to hear feedback. If you're going to have a gentle critique, all kinds of feedback are welcome. I'll do the best I can to listen and maybe shape the show in an even better direction down the road. Before we get to this week's interview, I wanted to share a family secret with our listeners. My son and I love bad movies. For me, it's those movies that are so bad you just can't help but love them. Like The Room, Troll 2, you know the drill. But my son is 9, so he just enjoys these movies as is. He's not a hipster, he doesn't think they're ironically awful, and he's not a film critic like his dad, so he's not examining every frame trying to think if it measures up to other films. He just thinks they're entertaining, and he does get that they're bad. He understands it on some level, but he doesn't let that stop him from enjoying it. And I have to say that I kind of let that wash over me as well when we watch these movies together. So it's led to some really great father-son bonding moments, including Killer Clowns from Outer Space. That might be my son's personal favorite. Also a horror movie that's just awful, but so awful it's good. It's called Jack Frost. And no, it's not that Michael Keaton dud. It's something else entirely. And I can't recommend a lot of these films, but again, holds a special place in our family's hearts, so say what we will about that. But more recently, our passions really betrayed us. I heard about a movie called Jurassic Dead. I asked a friend about it, and he seemed to indicate it wasn't too R-rated, wasn't too gory, wasn't too crazy, so I figured my son could give it a try. Also, I'm watching with him. If it became too bad, I could always shut it off. So we found it on Amazon, and we paid the rental fee. Only $2.99. Pretty cheap. Wonder why. This wasn't just another bad movie, and I expected it to be a bad movie. I had no dreams that this would be entertaining or nothing more than a rip-off of the Jurassic label at this point. But boy, this one was incompetence on a grand scale. If the budget was more than $1,000, they spent way too much. It is an absolute debacle. I've never seen a movie where people clearly were shot in a lot or a studio, and then they use computer trickery to kind of superimpose them onto the set. Now, I know that happens a lot, even in major motion pictures, but a movie this small, they couldn't go out on the field and shoot like any other movie might shoot a situation or a scene. It was that bad. The story, I can't even describe it. It starts one way, it veers another direction. It is unwatchable. Unwatchable. Now, I was thinking about the movie, just the fact that it exists, the fact that I could watch it so easily with a couple of clicks and a quick order up on my Amazon service. But, anything could be seen these days. You can watch the latest from Spielberg or Scorsese, or movies that are so bad, like Jurassic Dead, they should be made illegal in at least 30 states. I feel pretty strongly about that. Still, my son sat there, soaking it all in, chuckling now and then, and I kept looking over him gently, thinking, okay, if he gives me any kind of sign that we should shut this off, we could shut this off. If it's too much even for him, I'm on it. I'll just lunge for the remote, take care of things from there. Not a sign. And 82 minutes later, it was all over. Now, I'm sure we're going to keep on searching for really, really bad movies, and maybe we'll have some better experiences than we had with Jurassic Dead. But for now, movies like this, they're so bad that they're intolerable.
Don't touch that dial. You're listening to my daddy's podcast.
Here's a celebrity tweet of the week. This week's winner is Lena Dunham. We haven't heard much from Lena since Girls went off the air, but a recent tweet may have shown what she's been up to in the meantime. Here we go. Never trust anyone who doesn't regularly French kiss animals. Now, in her defense, she did later delete that tweet. My hit tip of the week is The Spectacular Now. This romance made some noise when it came out in 2013. It didn't go away, got some acclaim, some good reviews, but it's still one of the best teen romances I've seen in quite some time. It helps you have two rising stars here, Shailene Woodley and Miles Teller, in the lead roles. And the characters and play are dealing with his situation. He's got some personal demons. He's a wild child, party animal. Kind of typical. You've seen that a million times before, particularly in movies set in teenage realms. But this is much more fresh, more raw, more real, and their attraction is handled with a delicacy you don't often see, especially in mainstream Hollywood movies, let alone romances. I mean, Hollywood has almost given up on romances, so rom-coms are practically a thing of the past, but every once in a while, Hollywood gets it just right. Of course, the leads are great here, and I think millennials in particular will get the most out of this story, and what it means to fall in love with a very flawed individual. It's not helpless, it's not hopeless, but boy, you're in for a struggle, and you're going to have to really reach out to your partner to make things work. Now, I haven't seen this since it first came out. I'm really kind of curious to see it again. I imagine it'll hold up quite nicely, but you never know. But still, if you haven't seen it, do give it a try. It's just been added to the Netflix lineup, so easy as a stream. And let me know what you think. Again, you can always send feedback here, Christian@HollywoodInToto.com. Are my hit tip of the weeks working for you? Are they missing the mark? Are there any maybe tips you want to share with our listeners? Let me know.
You're listening to the Hollywood in Toto podcast, the right take on entertainment.
Now let's get to this week's HitCast interview. Conservatives face discrimination in a number of artistic fields. We've been talking about that quite a bit lately, but also that extends to the literary world. And Adam Bellow should know. He's been in the book trenches for quite some time now. He gets the subtle and sometimes not so subtle way conservative authors run into problems. But he's not just wringing his hands about it and complaining. He created Liberty Island, libertyislandmag.com, as a home for right-of-center authors where they can share their work and also, more importantly, build community with each other. We talked about the dawn of Liberty Island, how one author truly captures that site's purpose, and why pop culture matters. I hope that message sounds familiar to our listeners here, because I'm going to hit on it again and again. It's that important. Here's my interview with Liberty Island's Adam Bellow. Well, Adam, thanks for joining the show. I wanted to start with something kind of basic. I've just described what Liberty Island is, but I wanted you to maybe break down the why. Why do we need it in the first place?
So the answer to your question is, by way, like everything else, a story. The story is that I discovered the need for Liberty Island as a result of my work as a nonfiction book editor. I have been a conservative editor working in commercial publishing on the nonfiction side for 30 years and never published fiction at all in my career until just recently. And in fact, the reason that I became interested in fiction by conservatives is that a certain number of writers, nonfiction authors who I published at various houses, started to ask me whether I would consider a novel. This is not normally a question that a nonfiction editor wants to hear from a writer. The 6 most dreaded words any editor, nonfiction editor, hears from an author are my next book is a novel. And we say that because although we're very, we have great respect in the publishing world for fiction, we know that it's very, very difficult for anyone to get a novel published, let alone somebody with a conservative outlook. But I did entertain a number of these submissions, and I noticed more and more people were conservatives and libertarian writers were turning to somehow instinctually turning to storytelling and narrative. I think perhaps because they were beginning to feel confined in terms of their audience to a right-wing bubble. This is not something that was articulated explicitly, 5-6 years being talked about explicitly 5 or 6 years ago. But I think that nonetheless, it was clearly the case. Conservative writers who I've worked with for many, many years, extremely interesting, talented people, and they're confined to writing about policy and news, which is fine. It's what they do for a living for the most part, but it doesn't satisfy all of their longings as writers.
Yeah. Can I interrupt you? I want to hear the rest of this. I want to, just before you move on, though, you talk about it's harder for a conservative author to get that fiction piece published in a major publishing house. How does that play out? Is it they see the name and they recognize that Fred Smith is a conservative and maybe we don't want to go there, or is it more subtle, or is it a reaction to the material within the fiction work?
I would say that it depends on the case by case, but it's basically. And you could say that all of those things that you mentioned play a role, but the reality is that The reality is that there is an institutionalized feeder system that brings fiction to market, that prepares, trains, and inducts aspiring fiction authors into the publishing sort of this industrial feeder system, and it's been created over the years with great assiduousness by foundations and universities, small presses, and literary quarterlies, and MFA programs. And this is how people get novels published these days. There's no such thing. This is, I think, so, when we talk about bias, again, because that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about institutionalized anti-conservative bias, which I assure you exists. And to cut to the chase, there's no question that most editors in publishing are liberal. Most literary editors are extra liberal. They're very sensitive to the message and outlook of a writer. They're looking for books that they can fall in love with. This is how editors make choices in publishing. There's a lot of where stuff is submitted to us every day of the week. There are plenty of good books that you could publish. As an editor, you're looking for the book that you love, and the book you love is the one that you identify with. And so you can see how, kind of in a natural way, it would be an affinity game. But at the same, but what interests, and that's an important thing to understand. It certainly had an effect, on the nonfiction side in my career. I certainly confronted barriers to allowing conservative voices to be heard and conservative views to be expressed. Nevertheless, we beat down those barriers. We did succeed in institutionalizing a conservative voice in American publishing, and that's a huge success. But at the same time, what I want to call attention to is the existence of a feeder system, which also reflects the same cultural biases. It reflects the biases of its creators, the people who run these grant programs, these MFA programs, who edit the little quarterlies, who run the prize committees at foundations or at the Whiting Awards. There are all these prizes that are given out to young writers. So you're an aspiring fiction writer. You want to write novels. You after getting your English degree from Sarah Lawrence or whatever, then you go to the Iowa Writers Workshop, where you study with influential, writer, novelists, or poets, and then you get your work published in the little quarterly, and then you get a little prize as a kind of rising talent, and then you get something in the New Yorker, and then you get an agent, and then you get a publisher, and it's all a path that's been carved for you by the people who care passionately about books and literature. And now we're talking, by the way, this is the path for literary fiction. Mm-hmm. The path for genre, what we call genre fiction, which is where we're really at Liberty Island most active, is a little more open. It's not so credential driven, but it's essentially influenced by the same both institutional and unconscious biases. I don't want to get too into the weeds on this, but basically Liberty Island exists because I discovered about 5 or 6 years ago that a lot of conservatives were writing novels that could not be published in mainstream outlets. The reasons they could not be published were because the writers didn't have the right credentials. They had the wrong, outlook or point of view.
Mm-hmm.
They had the wrong hero, the wrong villain. The values implicit in their worldview and their outlook were not congenial to the agents that they applied to, or to the editors that their agents submitted their works to. And for all of these reasons, conservative storytellers were thwarted and turned to self-publishing. And that's where we hit the mother lode. That's where we found, when my partner David Bernstein and I began to discuss this problem, and we talked about it for a long time, much longer than this conversation is going to go on. And we started looking around on Amazon in particular, in the sort of self-publishing category, and we found dozens, scores, literally, of books written by conservatives and libertarians in a variety of popular genres. And it's interesting also to note that there are certain clusters, certain areas of the fiction world that attract people of different ideological dispositions. For example, science fiction is very appealing to libertarians. That's fascinating to me because you can see why, in a way, you have the freedom to create your own world and run it as a kind of experiment. And some great science fiction is really written, and a lot of great science fiction does this. Plays out different sort of utopian or dystopian political scenarios to see how they will work out. So we discovered that there was a big, in terms of, because we're capitalists, we're looking for supply, which we found in abundance, and then for demand. Because as publishers, the idea is to connect the supply and the demand, and bring writers and readers together. And that's what Liberty Island is intended to do. So that's the why of Liberty Island. The why of Liberty Island is that we discovered that there is what amounts to a new counterculture arising on the right in reaction to the dominance of what used to be the old counterculture. I'm old enough to remember when the counterculture of the 60s and 70s was, radically left-wing, and in fact, a lot of it radically libertarian. And over time, over the years, that ethos, that spirit, that cultural energy, and the people who rose to prominence as a result of that culture of revolution in popular culture became the man, in time. And they exercise their own biases, their tastes, and their predilections and their biases, and it's been my observation, and not just mine, but other people on the right, that culture in the hands of the late boomers and the 60s generation has become more aggressively political, more progressive in its more sort of self-conscious in its progressivism.
One thing I wanted to jump in here about, when I think about what's going on in the culture, I think, the left and right have different ideas, different sensibilities. We get that. But the one place we can all kind of come together and have our kumbaya moment is on freedom of expression. And I think that's been changing right dramatically in recent years. I want to, you're sort of in the belly of the beast in certain ways. What do you see happening with what I think is left-of-center people trying to either censor or silence or diminish right-of-center voices? Am I being too dramatic about it, or what's your take on the culture from that perspective?
No, I don't think you can be too dramatic about it, and it's going on all over the place. Most interestingly, from the point of view of this conversation, because we know that it's going on college campus, that gets coverage. What isn't getting so much coverage are the social justice wars within the individual fiction genres, the subgenres. In many of these, each genre of fiction, science fiction, thriller, fantasy, detective, romance. There are each of these categories, which are publishing categories, also connote communities of readers and writers. Mm-hmm. They're very intense little subcultures, and people, they're very, very active online, of course. And the writers and they all consider themselves citizens of a kind of a community. And in the last several years, there's been more and more outright, unabashed efforts to eject conservatives from these communities, and to deny them prizes, and to attack them, and try to literally drive them out in silence and shut them down. So there's definitely been a change. There's been and on the larger societal level, as we, I'm sure, all realize, and liberals are beginning themselves, traditional liberals. Let's say someone like Alan Dershowitz, who I publish in my day job at St. Martin's Press, is an example of a kind of traditional liberal who has always considered himself a man of the left in a kind of lazy way that liberals of a certain era tend to do, without realizing that there's a difference between liberalism and leftism. So this difference tends to get elided, but every once in a while, every 20 years or so, an issue arises that exposes the genuine difference, the rift between liberals and leftists. And free speech is one of those issues. And what's going on campus today, the most visible arena, is opening up that kind of a rift between, for liberals. So there's going to be, there's clearly going to be more of this kind of conflict, and this sort of, kind of quiet, almost unconscious bias, which has prevailed up to now prevailed, or been allowed to prevail in the publishing world, is now being amplified by new cadres of vocal, aggressive, left-wing social justice warriors who are coming out of the universities and are entering into the institutions and establishment of the cultural, and media establishment, and their presence is definitely being felt. Wow. So, for example, you might have heard that there are now going to be what are called sensitivity readers in the young adult category. Every book published for young adults is now going to be read by a kind of moral, censor, basically. Somebody who will signal to the editor or publisher of the book, this is inappropriate, this is offensive, this is going to turn somebody, turn somebody off or make somebody feel unsafe, and publishers are nice people. They don't want anyone to feel unsafe or offended, and they certainly don't want any backlash from books that they publish. So they're being proactive in sort of, inviting that kind of censorship and bringing it on themselves. That's an aspect of a conversation that could go on for a long time.
Yeah, and it's very scary, and it's good that we're talking about it. But also, if you had told me I'd be having this conversation with anyone 10 years ago, I would have laughed and said, "Of course not. That's not the way things work." But that's where we are right now. We're talking with Adam Bellow, CEO and editorial director of Liberty Island. You can find out more at libertyislandmag.com. I want to just quickly talk about, what does it mean, a right-of-center artist? And is there the fear, or even when you look at new work, are you fearful that the message, and I'll put that in kind of quotes, gets pushed ahead of the storytelling? Because I know that's often a complaint that people have for liberal stories, that it's too heavy-handed, it's too obvious. Do you see that on the right, or do you find that the artists that you introduce to the world are more delicate in that sensibility?
Well, it's a question that comes up a lot, and I think there are really sort of two ways to answer it. One is to say that, of course, we, as there's a tremendous amount of, the good news is there's a tremendous amount of writing being done, creative work, high quality creative work being done across the genres of popular fiction and literary fiction by writers who are conservative or libertarian in their outlook. There's also a very wide spectrum of quality, as there would be in any large sample of aspiring writers and artists. One of the problems that people have coming from this, perspective from the right or center right, is that they don't really have access to the kind of support and talent development and encouragement and basically mentoring and feeder and that whole feeder system that we were describing earlier. That doesn't exist. It doesn't exist for people on the right in the way that it does for people who are apolitical, which is to say liberal, because I think that basically functionally is the same thing in our place and time. So part of the problem is, the challenge, let's say, is that our writers coming up on our side, really do need more support. They need more exposure. They need more training. We need those things too. And I think one of the things I consistently advocate for when speaking before conservative groups or talking to potential donors and funders is please invest resources in the next generation of conservative creatives, just as you do in the next generation of conservative journalists or policy thinkers or scholars or activists and political candidates, because the culture is the most powerful organ of persuasion and change that we have available. Now, the other answer to your question is, so on the one hand, as publishers exercise our own taste and judgment and discretion when selecting books to publish, and we feel that we say no to a lot of the stuff that is submitted to us because it is, either it lacks sophistication on a basic craft level, or because the messaging is too obvious or heavy-handed and outweighs the story. The model, I think, that I would cite is somebody like sort of a range of writers from Tom Clancy to Tom Wolfe.
It's a good range.
Good range, plenty of room in there for all kinds of fiction, all kinds of stories to be told. And with both of those authors, you know where they're coming from, but they're not hitting you over the head with it. Clancy is basically telling you a morality tale, and it's through the selection of heroes and villains and the virtues that are dramatized and praised, and the vices that are condemned, which include ideological vices. That's how you read his politics. At the same time, I would also say this. My bias as a publisher is to say, who am I to judge? There are readers for every kind of book. Ayn Rand being a very good example. A lot of people would agree, I think, that Ayn Rand's novels are not great as novels. They're didactic works. They're works of philosophy lightly dramatized. She's not Dickens or Tolstoy. Nevertheless, she has gifts. She has skills. She's a kind of a mesmerizing writer in a way, and she allows her characters to speechify and to make ideological pronouncements. And millions of people have read her book. So who am I to judge? It's like, I don't want to be a snob. That's not my job as a publisher. I'm not a literary critic. I'm in business, and my job is to publish books for every taste. Yeah. And so, to that extent, my philosophy is, publish everything anything that has an audience. it's not to my taste, but it might be to somebody else's. So we try to balance these values.
Mm-hmm. And with a website, you have more room. You don't have to worry about sort of space in that. I had one last question for you, Adam, and it's a very unfair one, but I'm going to say it anyway. I want you to pick one of your artists, just maybe someone who just comes to mind at first thinking. It kind of maybe epitomizes what Liberty Island is all about, or just jumps out at you saying, wow, this is someone that I really want more people to hear. And I know there are multiple artists who absolutely fit that bill, but just for time's sake, I just want to, maybe you could mention one to wrap things up, and we'll steer people at the show notes page at HollywoodInToto.com to other worthy artists too, so it won't be totally unfair. But just off the top of your head, who do you think is someone you could kind of steer people to right away?
Well, of course, it's a terrible question to ask a publisher.
I know.
It's terribly unfair, and I'm afraid to answer. But since you asked me for somebody who's a sort of a representative Liberty Island author, I will single out Roy M. Griffiths, known to us affectionately as Griff. Griff is. I think he epitomizes the model of the Liberty Island author, because he is totally self-taught, completely isolated, cheerfully laboring in total obscurity for years, producing damn good books. And the books that we're publishing by Griff are the what we call the Lonesome George Chronicles, and it is a. I'm sorry if you hear that siren outside.
You're a New York resident, so I know the drill. It's okay.
This is authentic New York.
That's right.
Background noise. We were very moved by Griff, who we really consider to be one of our earliest and finest discoveries. He's a very talented writer. The Lonesome George Chronicles tells the story of an America in an alternate present after the country fell to a combined Chinese communist and jihadi invasion in the last year of George W. Bush's presidency. And so instead of things continuing as they did historically, America falls, is carved up by hostile powers, and then we fast forward to the time frame of the novel, and it is there's a resistance that is beginning to coalesce, and we follow various sort of resistance cells around the country. And in the background, there is George W. Bush himself, who is comes to be known as Lonesome George. One of the things the story, the writing is terrific, the story's compelling. It's a multi-volume series. One of the things that I particularly like about it is that Griff has incorporated some real-life liberal media figures who, like Alec Baldwin, who get woke, after the Muslims invade and establish a caliphate in California, and he realizes that he was wrong, and he becomes a resistance leader, and it's really delightful, I think, and very playful of Griff to do that.
Yeah, I think that twist alone has got me hooked. So that's a great example.
Yeah.
Well, Adam, thank you again for joining the HitCast. Please visit libertyislandmag.com for some more great new content. Support the authors on that site. Follow them, see what they're up to, and maybe steer some other voices toward libertyislandmag.com, because that is an essential place for people to fight the culture war one book at a time. Adam, thank you so much. I really want to kind of continue the conversation on multiple levels, but we're out of time. But maybe you can come back and we can check out some more conversations.
Oh, I would love to do that. Thanks, Christian. This was fun.
Well, thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out HollywoodInToto.com for both the show notes and, of course, the latest entertainment news. Please follow me at Twitter at HollywoodInToto. And we'd love it if you leave a podcast review over at iTunes. See you next week.